The Shadows of Yor are responsible for some of the most evil crimes in the Destiny universe, burning the town of Palamon to the ground, slaughtering innocent guardians in the Crucible with weapons of sorrow. When you think of this hateful cult, a name that might pop straight into your head because he is their leader may be Dredgen Yor. But did you know that there were actually other corrupted guardians who helped forge this group of terror? Welcome to the channel, everybody. Today we're going to dive into the history of Dredgen Vale. Have you heard the whispers, brothers? Sister? The shadow speaks. All we have to do is listen. Its secrets are a gift. Its gift? Our evolution. The others misunderstand. We are the weapons of sorrow, living and free, the hated heroes of this broken age. So a character by the name of Zyre Orsa is a hunter who is mentioned in the latest addition to Destiny's lore books, which is in Destiny 2, and it's titled the Book of the Unmaking. So in this video we're going to explain Teben Grey and Zyre Orsa's brief backstory and how and why he converted his name to Dredgen Vale. Now, the following stories can be found from that Book of the Unmaking, and they are read from the perspective of Teben Grey. Teben and Zyre Orsa, who will turn into Dredgen Vale, seek what it means to tread the ways of the dark. In these tales, they'll go behind the Vanguard's back, venture to Dwindler's Ridge, and learn what Dredgen Yor was up to all that time ago. So I'm going to read a bunch of these entries. We may add a little bit of information in between, but we'll discuss all of it at the end. Our search began with a legend, Dredgen Yor, the hated scourge upon the Guardian's good name. Any attempts to seek details on his deeds were met with dismissal. The Vanguard would not see us, uniformly, not just on an individual basis, but by some long-standing internal decree. Lord Shax came at us with threats. He is very protective of his charge as overseer of the Crucible. None of us blame him. The competition is vital to Guardian survival, both in the way it forcibly hones skill and how it serves a necessary dual role as moral booster and stress reliever. There are a few places a Guardian can let loose, like they can in the controlled arenas of Shax's quarantined fighting pits. The search for the truth of Yor's tale was not easy. If official records existed, they were hidden beyond our purview, and the realities of the legend were tracked only by word of mouth. The fabled Dwindler's Ridge was not on any map. The burned ground where Palamon once stood wasn't marked as anyone's sacred site, and the renegade who'd felled Yor had not been seen for some time following that fated showdown. Despite all of this, we were not deterred. If anything, Orsa and I and the others who followed were driven by the difficulty of our chosen task. That a Guardian could be corrupted, our gifts twisted, not by greed or lust or power, but by influences beyond petty human desires, was a concern greater, maybe, than any other. Were we not honored with our return because of some inherent nobility? If so, how could one of us, any of us, fall to damnation? Or was this heroic interpretation of our role in a grander scheme nothing more than the surest sign of our blind innocence? After all, it feels good to imagine oneself a hero, morally superior and standing tall on the side of righteous hope. The question we would ask then is simple. How well do we, any of us, truly know ourselves? We then have the next entry. We found the craft undisturbed in low orbit, its course synchronized to the exact coordinates of its master's final resting place some 1800 kilometers below. We suspected an anomaly in its mechanics on approach. Locking to the faint ping of its nav drive, our instruments detected a low guttural whine, otherwise lost in the vacuum of the post-atmosphere emptiness between worlds. Its tethering, the fact that it was chained to the specific coordinates of the ridge, was not directly linked to the craft's onboard systems, but instead to desire. The ship was waiting in pained anguish for his return. The hull was more of husk, harsh and jagged from the growth. We'd never seen a ship crusted in the bone of unknown death, but were more intrigued than concerned. The whispers started on approach, faint, hushed. Moments later, our ears began to bleed. You have to understand, we were still very new to the path we'd tread. Boarding Yor's derelict craft in the search of our first answers was an act of children, ignorant to the truths and the dangers that marked our journey. It wasn't until later, when more of the pieces of the whole were uncovered, that we grasped the reality of the odd white noise gnawing at the edges of our thoughts. Anymore, we call them whispers, but then, in those early days as we approached and entered the craft, we mistook their siren call for feedback from a dying ship's failing systems. We were fools. Orsa then found scribbled glyphs in the thick leather inside the craft that once, long ago, belonged to Yor. We couldn't identify the origin of the writing at this time, much less translate. Though we'd heard all the stories of the Hive, an ancient evil and an ancient battle that turned Luna into our forbidden zone. Most held them as folklore, scary stories to counteract our natural curiosity and keep brave guardians from venturing beyond their means. And while we had our theories about Dredgen Yor and how his fall was linked to the nightmare tales of wicked creatures born of bone and shadow, we were cautious not to let assumption guide our inquisition. Standing on the ridge as the sun fell, Orsa and I held a silent communion. I remember peace in that moment, peace and acceptance. The course we had set was not frivolous curiosity, but a real, solid, important investigation into an outlawed tragedy that had claimed one of our forebearers. Who was Yor? Not just at his end, but prior, before madness had consumed him. Could his life inform our own? Could its lessons prevent any other from such violent downfall? We'd been warned that there were no answers waiting down this road, only sorrow. But standing there, the fading light, the tall grass, and the scorched circle where a villain was gunned down and nothing grew, the weight of answers to come was not our concern. The understandings earned on the journey forward would be their own reward. Every step would make us new. Every discovery would further our grasp of the unknown worlds beyond the light. It was some time later when Orsa came to me with the writings from a cryptarch's archives. We'd spent a long while attempting to translate the glyphs found on Yor's ship, to no avail. Great care was taken though in furthering our investigation. We weren't really hiding our work per se, but it was not advertised. We'd been scolded and warned enough times that we knew to continue our efforts in private as best we could. By this point, the Vanguard ranks had sort of shifted. Brask was no fan of our work, but he was reasonable. His exo replacement was more pointed in his dismissal though, a byproduct of his relationship with Lord Shax, I'd imagine, but that's neither here nor there. We traded with many cryptarchs over the years, and Orsa had long since made it a point to get on their good side. Even still, it took some convincing and full-on bribery to eventually get our hands on the tomes needed to crack the mystery of the arcane texts. The books and writings we secured from the tradesmen were incomplete and mostly scholarly guesswork, but there were enough translations and competent theory to provide a foundation for our own interpretations. After that, it wasn't long before the pieces started to fall into place. We still had much to learn, but we were certain of a few key ingredients. Yor had been to Luna. Whether his corruption began there or led him there was still unknown, and the glyphs that he'd etched had spoke of a great unmaking, the truth of which would be our own. Unmaking. For the longest time, we thought it was a threat, but as our work continued and we deciphered more and more of the glyphs, we came to see it as something more. A promise. Yor's etchings were a roadmap, arcane and cryptic, but with specific intent. Old research hinted at mysterious tomes labeled as Books of Sorrows. With these books, it was theorized by researchers long before our time that the Hive had their own set of holy texts, evidence of which had been gathered before the Great Disaster. These books were believed to be archives of Hive ritual and history, chronicling royal bloodlines and varied ceremonials and rites of passage. With this knowledge, we were uncertain of the place Yor's etching held in the overall picture of Hive legend, but they do fit our understanding of these fabled books. As such, through hubris or educated conclusion is a distinction I'll leave to others to decide, but we chose to collect our translations in accordance to a new entry in the supposed Library of Sorrow, a seventh book we called it. And writing this now upon reflection in the last days before the next stage in our journey, I know, we were right to do so. Any guardian with interest in old nightmares has heard the stories of the weapons of sorrow, deadly tools said to be infected and warped by twisted science verging on mysticism. In particular, Thorn, the cursed weapon of the light killer Dredgen Yor. But such tools of destruction were only rumor. There was direct evidence of Yor having been a vile bastard, but the legends of a sickly weapon and disease it spread seemed exaggerated, just another ghost story to warn of unknown dangers. But our translations of the ancient Hive text seem to point to truth in the legend. The Hive did have rituals for forced evolution, and what we'd found hinted at transmutation through corruption, degradation, and rebirth. The weapons of sorrow were real. Worse, they had a roadmap to a greater threat, a greater evil. And with this realization, our determination to uncover Yor's full truth was bolstered by new, terrifying questions. What if the horrors of Yor's deeds were not the endgame? What if his evolution was simply the byproduct of a grander design? What if he was nothing more than a side effect of an ancient arms race, and the weapons we'd fear from days long past were nothing more than touchstones and a roadmap to devastation beyond anything we can imagine? What if sorrow was just a pit stop on the road to our coming annihilation? So I know that was definitely a lot, and if you're still with me, I thank you very much, but this story is pretty interesting, and it also gives us some hints at what might happen in the future with the Drifter. So first up, we can see that throughout the whole book that Teben and Zyre Orsa went behind the Vanguard's back to study the ways of Dredgen Yor. Here they learned of the truths that the weapons of sorrow did exist, and the power of unmaking would make them into their possible final form. So of course, all the information I just read was added within the Last Word quest January 29th, but this isn't the first time we hear of Orsa and Teben. We actually had some cards back in Destiny 1 which are pretty mysterious. So with the information from D1, we know that Orsa was a hunter who went into the Crucible with Thorn and preyed on various innocent guardians. But this was a little bit different. It wasn't just like Dredgen Yor where he just rained madness everywhere he went. These guardians like Orsa did go into the Crucible with things like Thorn, but their goal was to not become infected by its ways like their leader had. We can see some of the examples of their terror from various D1 Crucible cards. The first one says this: "We were facing a full squad. I recognized a couple of them, Orsa, Teben, but they were different, decked out in dark gear and set to intimidate. I took it as an attempt at psychological warfare, up the creep factor in a creepy place, but it was more than that. They had changed." And next we have this: "I'm assuming you're aware of the events on Mars, the results from Blindwatch? Yes, it may be starting again. Not saying it is, but we need to keep an eye on anyone who would seek to retrace Yor's path." Agreed, but Orsa and his friends seem to have contained what Yor could not. A dangerous assumption. The Thorn's pestilence is becoming commonplace. Thorn, huh? Freshly crafted, you like? A little risky playing with something that's been known to kill guardians, isn't it? Look where you are. Everything in the system's been known to kill guardians. Sure, but there's facing trouble and then there's asking for it. This isn't like the stories we've heard about Yor. Vale figured this out, tamed it. Can you tame sickness? Good question, let's go pick a fight and find out. Never seen anything like it. Orsa, or Vale, whatever he calls himself. Coming out on top wasn't even in his plans. He'd just drop us and leave our crest scattered around the combat zone. I don't think he collected one. Others didn't care, figured it gave them a chance to pull the win, but I cared, win or not. That kind of cocky ain't healthy. I don't think cocky is the right word. But Guardians, that pretty much does it for today's little backstory on Zyre Orsa, who converted his name into Dredgen Vale and began taking up the ways of the shadows in the Crucible. The hope of Teben and Vale was to wield Thorn and these dark weapons of power in the Crucible, but to not become engulfed in the darkness like their founder. From the papers on Yor's dead body to the intimidating armor in the Crucible, you can definitely expect to learn more on these shadows soon, especially in the season of the Drifter. Anyway, if you did enjoy this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for some more awesome Destiny 2 news and entertainment. Also, just a little shout out before we go, as we're discussing all this Dredgen Yor and Shadow stuff here. I currently have a project in the works where we're going to make a little cinematic short around Dredgen Yor and Shin Mapfur. It might be like a minute or two, nothing too huge, but it's going to have some pretty good graphics, and I'm going to have some professional motion capture equipment available to me in the next couple of months. So if you are a 3D artist and can create models in Unity's high definition render pipeline, definitely send me some of your work over on Twitter. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. My name's Evade, and I'll catch you Guardians in the next one.